The alien girl laughed at his weakness. Then he picked her up and threw her onto the bed. He stood in the half-lit corridor, boots planted on slick metal flooring. The air smelled of ozone and chemical disinfectants, laced with the faint hum of distant machinery. Her figure moved at the edge of his vision like a stalking cat, her skin catching the light and subtle shifts of violet. She halted a few feet away, and for an instant neither breathed a word. His gaze swept over her, lingering on the harsh lines of her armor, the deadly grace in her posture, the glow of her unearthly eyes. Then a small, knowing smile touched her lips, as though she found this moment far too amusing. "You dare approach me like that?" she said. Her voice sliced the silence with a taunt, vibrating at a frequency that set his teeth on edge. His answering smirk didn't come right away. He let the tension hold, let it coil around them, before he replied. He knew that if he answered too quickly, if he let her see he was rattled by her voice, she would own him from the start. Instead, Ryland Voss gave a low, mirthless chuckle that said everything about how little fear he felt. She arched an eyebrow, reading that challenge in his eyes. He'd always pictured the alien species as more insectal or monstrous, not sleek goddesses with a cool, hypnotic beauty. Yet Sariaki was anything but delicate. The way she held herself made his warrior instincts flare. He had half a mind to draw his sidearm, except he'd seen her kind move too fast to track when threatened. She studied him right back, undoubtedly noting the tension in his muscled frame, the smirk that gave away his reckless nature. On the walls, broken lights flickered, making her bioluminescent markings shift and glow. "You're not what I expected," he finally said. His voice was quiet and cold, scraping against the hush like metal on stone. He didn't break eye contact. Hers was a species rumored to sense fear, to smell weakness and sweat. For all she knew, he was half mad from the tragedies he'd survived, so fear wasn't even in his vocabulary. But something about her demanded his attention in a way no enemy had before. Even the air seemed charged, laced with an electricity that leapt between them. She tilted her head, letting a strand of shimmering hair fall across one shoulder. The faint luminescence along her arms pulsed, as if she drew energy from his presence. "I could say the same. Humans rarely come this far into the restricted zones. Especially not ones who walk straight up to me as though they own the place." Ryland shrugged one broad shoulder. "I stopped caring about boundaries a long time ago." Her lips quirked again, a mocking half-smile. "Is that how you justify your trespass?" He took a step closer, ignoring the voice in his head that urged caution. His entire life after the massacre of his unit had been about pushing boundaries until they broke. "I don't need to justify anything to you," he said. "You're the one who's going to answer to me." She laughed. It was a short, crystalline sound that rippled the air and made the lights overhead flicker like they'd lost power for a millisecond. Her species, he remembered reading, sometimes emitted subtle electromagnetic pulses when agitated, or aroused. He couldn't say which emotion fueled that laugh, but it carried a note of dangerous delight. "You think you can make me answer?" she asked, stepping forward, her tall frame nearly matching his. "Why not try?" Ryland snapped his arms up, seizing her wrist in a move that should have pinned her to the wall. She twisted with liquid grace, flipping his grip and nearly wrenching his arm out of its socket. He growled under his breath, switching to a grappling stance. The corridor wasn't wide, and their bodies collided in a storm of muscle and sudden bursts of power. She might have been leaner, but there was no doubt she packed a punch. She slammed him against the metal wall, and the back of his skull hit it with a clang. He clenched his jaw, ignoring the flash of pain, and used his superior bulk to throw her off. For a heartbeat, they were locked in a test of raw strength, face to face, breath mingling. The air was scorching, each of them radiating a lethal vibe that refused to back down. She let out a soft hiss of effort, her glowing eyes narrowed. And then, with a vicious twist, he managed to spin her around, pressing her front against the wall. He pinned her wrists above her head, hooking one arm under her chin. Their bodies were tight together, heat rolling off them in waves. Her voice was breathless, but still mocking. "So you do know a few tricks." An instant later, her foot slammed into his calf, buckling his stance. She wrenched free, nearly sending him toppling to the floor. The corridor around them was scarred with signs of battle, and these two were just another skirmish in a war no one had asked for. Yet this exchange felt too personal. Neither wanted to kill the other yet. This was more of a game, an insane, deadly game of who would dominate first. A klaxon sounded somewhere in the distance, and flashing red lights washed across the corridor. Both of them froze, panting, eyes locked, as the realization sank in that they just triggered an alarm. "If you're here for me, you'd better move fast," she murmured, rubbing her wrists and glancing over her shoulder. "Soon, the entire station is going to come down on your head." Rylan bared his teeth. "Then show me the way out, or I'll drag you with me." He could barely think over the rush of blood in his ears. She made him more reckless than he'd ever been. But he was no fool. A horde of armed guards would be swarming soon. Enemy or not, she was his best chance to cut a path through. She shrugged, the motion causing the markings on her skin to shift in swirling patterns. "Fine. Keep up, human." A sly grin curved her mouth before she sped off, forcing him to follow. He cast one glance down the corridor, saw dark figures racing closer. Bullets pinged off the walls, and he darted after her, adrenaline fueling his every stride. The close call jolted him back to the reality of the station's labyrinthine corridors. One wrong turn, and he'd be trapped. They sprinted side by side, exchanging glances that crackled with unresolved tension. Through twisting passages, under flickering lights, they both leapt over debris and ducked beneath steaming pipes. Every so often, they caught sight of heavily armed guards surging from side corridors. Sariaki would raise her hand and let out a piercing, subsonic cry that cracked their visors or shorted out their weapons. Rylan used the openings to disable them, quick and merciless. The station lurched with the force of internal explosions. Someone was trying to either flush them out or sabotage the entire place. Overhead, sparks showered. Steel beams groaned. Twice, Rylan had to grab her arm to keep her from stepping into a collapsing walkway. Each time, their eyes met. No words passed between them, but the tension only built, layered with the sharp tang of fear and excitement. They ducked into an elevator alcove, panting. The hum of the station's emergency power made the floor vibrate beneath their feet. She punched in a code on the panel, but an error beep responded. Her jaw tightened. Rylan's eyes flicked to the corridor behind them, hearing boots pounding. If they were about to get pinned down, they needed a new plan. He let out a frustrated snarl. "We'll find another way." Sariaki's markings flared as she slammed her fist against the console, sending a spark of electromagnetic power through the system. Lights flickered, the panel shorted, and the doors slid open on a half-lit shaft. "Shaft's locked down," she said in clipped tones. "But maybe we can climb." Without waiting for his agreement, she launched herself onto the maintenance rungs inside. For a second, Rylan just watched her scaled, violet forearms bulge with contained strength. Then he heard the echo of approaching gunfire and followed her onto the rungs, the door hissing shut behind him. Inside, the darkness was claustrophobic, the air thick with chemical fumes from the station's failing reactors. They climbed, the environment trembling. Rylan realized if the station fell apart, they'd be sealed in a metal tomb. But every time the possibility of death crossed his mind, his gaze fell on her, clinging to the rungs above him, her form haloed by the faint glow from her skin. He grit his teeth, forcing himself not to dwell on what drew him to this alien who should have been his mortal enemy. She noticed his stare, glancing down with an archly raised eyebrow. "You might want to hurry," she said, and though her words were sharp, something softer flickered in her tone. He pressed on. "Don't worry about me," he said, ignoring the leap of his pulse. They emerged onto another level, where emergency lights provided faint illumination. She led him down a hallway, each step bringing them dangerously close to an area labeled in alien script. He didn't read her language, but her tension told him this was either a weapons facility or something equally dangerous. She paused at a pair of sealed doors, typed a quick sequence into a control panel, and they slid open. Another corridor stretched ahead, this one deserted for the moment, with thick glass windows on one side revealing a docking bay. Through that glass, Ryland saw crafts launching amid swirling sparks. A siren bleated overhead, a dull mechanical warning that forced them to move faster. He caught sight of a smaller craft, possibly for official use, but it looked intact. They just had to get to it. He moved closer to her. "I need a ship. You're taking me there." She flashed him a mocking grin. "Yes, because I'm so eager to be your personal pilot. Think of it as self-preservation," he growled. "You're no safer in here than I am." She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "I'm never safe. That's how I thrive." He heard the footsteps before she did, spinning around in time to see a squad of uniformed aliens armed with crackling energy pikes. They wore black armor with shimmering insignias, and their leader barked a command in a guttural language Ryland didn't understand. But Sariaki clearly did. She tensed, the glow of her markings intensifying. "They want me to surrender," she said. "They want me to hand over the human." She looked at him, something like wicked delight in her gaze. "Shall we comply?" He barked a laugh. "Surrender isn't in my vocabulary." She arched her neck. "Then stand aside. I'll show you how we handle traitors." Before he could protest, she stepped forward and let out a subsonic hiss. The guards staggered, gripping their helmets. Ryland noticed the glass behind them crackling under the strain of her electromagnetic field. He took advantage of the confusion, charging the squad. With brutal efficiency, he knocked aside pikes and delivered bone-shattering blows. Sariaki fought with a dancer's fluidity, each strike aimed with lethal precision. When the last guard fell, panting and half-conscious, Ryland pressed a boot to the leader's chest. "That's for the ambush you and your kind pulled on my unit," he snarled, although he knew this guard wasn't personally responsible. Hatred still roiled in him, but now it was tangled up with the strange, compelling presence at his side. Sariaki looked on, her expression unreadable. He glanced up, saw her smirk. "You don't waste time, do you? Not when my life's on the line." He stepped away, letting the guard crumple. "Move!" They hurried down the corridor, stepping over debris and unconscious foes. The siren overhead grew louder, and the entire station trembled again. Then they reached a large set of blast doors overlooking the docking bay. Frantic lights and klaxons gave everything a nightmarish glow. A craft was fueling up, its engines whining as if someone else had already powered it. Ryland silently thanked fate for handing them a quick exit, unless it was a trap. He pressed a hand to her elbow. "We take that ship, or we die here." Her gaze flicked to him, full of sharp challenges. "Don't you dare slow me down." They sprinted, weaving past crates and fueling hoses, ignoring the chaos around them. A few stray guards shouted, but they were too busy staving off station-wide collapse. The floor cracked as explosions rocked the station's core. Without hesitation, the two of them dove into the ship's open hatch. Ryland slammed the panel to seal it behind them. The metallic clang echoed through the docking bay, and almost immediately, a fresh wave of blasts rattled the hull. Sariaki slid into the pilot's seat, her fingers flying over alien controls. The ship hummed to life, engines thrumming with pent-up power. Ryland strapped into the co-pilot's station, scanning the readouts. Most were alien script, but some basic metrics were universal: fuel levels, engine temperatures. He watched her work, enthralled despite himself. She was unstoppable, confidence radiating from every line of her body. She snapped the throttle. The craft lurched, then soared out of the docking bay, plunging into the star-flecked void. Ryland's stomach flipped at the sudden G-force. Alarms blared behind them, but they were out, free, if only for the moment. A blockade of alien vessels hovered in the distance, but Sariaki banked sharply, weaving through debris with near-surgical skill. Ryland couldn't deny a spark of admiration, even though she was the enemy. Up ahead, an entire fleet reconfigured to intercept. She grimaced. "Hang on," she hissed, flipping switches. Energy shields flared around them. They plunged through a cluster of enemy fighters, which fired sporadically. The ship trembled, systems whining. One bolt of plasma sizzled past the viewport. Rylan stiffened, expecting to face a fiery end. But Sariaki twisted the controls, maneuvering them through a narrow gap. The starfield beyond opened up, and soon they were accelerating into open space. He exhaled, tension in every muscle. She shot him a glance. Not bad for a primitive species, yes? He smirked, though his pulse was racing. You've earned half a compliment. Keep going. The jump gate was looming, a swirling vortex of cosmic energy. The station behind them burst into flames, collapsing into itself, and the blockade parted to avoid the shockwave. Sariaki seized the opportunity, diving into the gate. Colors warped around them, and Rylan felt like his body was being dragged through a tornado of starlight. Then, with a final jolt, they popped out on the other side, drifting into a quiet star system. Silence fell, except for the faint hum of the ship's engines. He unbuckled and stood. She remained in the pilot's seat, hands resting lightly on the controls, chest rising and falling from exertion. The strange moment settled around them. They were alone together now, far from the station, far from any immediate threat. But the tension between them was still there, thrumming just beneath the surface. "We're not safe yet," she said, and he couldn't ignore the slightly husky undertone in her voice. "They'll track this ship eventually." He leaned over the console, scanning for any sign of pursuit. The sensors were clear for now, but it wouldn't last. "I doubt we have much time." She turned, violet skin catching the dim lights of the cockpit. "Where do you plan to go?" Rylan's jaw tightened. He had no real plan besides surviving and continuing his crusade. "There's a fringe world," he muttered, "beyond the grasp of your empire. We can hide, resupply." Sariaki's eyes narrowed. "You think I want to go with you?" He stepped closer, ignoring the voice that told him he was dangerously close to her. "You don't have much choice unless you want to drift in space without a co-pilot who can handle human systems. This craft might be alien, but half its components came from human contractors. Look." He gestured to a patchwork of standardized engineering panels. Her gaze flicked to them, then back at him. He recognized the reluctance on her face, but also the grudging acknowledgement of reality. She needed him as much as he needed her. "Fine," she murmured. "But if you try anything, spare me the threats," he said, though his voice was quieter than before. Something about this small space, sealed away from the dangers of outside, made every breath, every word, feel intimate. Even her glowing markings seemed to pulse in time with her quickening heartbeat. He could see the faint line of sweat along her temple, reflecting just how intense that escape had been. She stood abruptly, stepping out of the pilot's chair. Suddenly, they were inches apart, the hum of the ship's life support the only background noise. Her eyes bored into him, assessing, daring him. He refused to break the stare, despite the magnetic pull of her presence. He was torn between the urge to push her away and the urge to grip her hips and slam her against the nearest bulkhead. She gave a sardonic laugh, noticing the tension in his body. "You want to kill me?" she whispered. "Or something else entirely?" Her voice wrapped around him, setting every nerve on edge. "What's stopping you?" He exhaled, the air thick with unspoken violence and attraction. "You saved my life back there," he admitted finally. "I don't kill those who fight by my side. And right now, we're still in danger. We'd do better to focus on that." She tilted her head, almost disappointed. "Coward," she said, but it was a challenge more than an insult. He bared his teeth in a humorless smile. "Say that again when we aren't trapped in a cockpit surrounded by vacuum." She snorted softly and moved past him, brushing his arm. Every hair on his body stood on end from that fleeting contact. He watched her vanish into the narrow corridor leading to the ship's living quarters. With a low exhalation, he shook off the dizzying rush of adrenaline. He hated that her very proximity affected him. He hated that the primal part of his mind hadn't been thinking of revenge, but rather how her skin would feel against his. Over the next tense hours, they steered the ship toward the coordinates of a fringe planet known as Dehar Prime, a place riddled with smugglers, criminals, and outcasts. Not exactly a paradise, but better than the alternative. Rylan occasionally left the cockpit to check the ship's systems. Sariaki lingered in the engine room, using her electromagnetic abilities to stabilize the battered craft. They spoke little, but even in the quiet, their presence was a constant, pulsing reminder that neither was alone. When they finally dropped out of faster-than-light speed near Dehar Prime, Rylan got his first glimpse of the planet's swirling teal atmosphere. Orbital debris circled like a graveyard of broken ships, but the planet itself was rumored to have enough pockets of civilization to hide them. Sariaki guided them to a scoundrel's landing zone, ignoring the automated defenses that half-heartedly targeted them. A few bribes and scrambled identification codes got them clearance. They touched down on a landing pad nestled against craggy cliffs. The sky overhead was a hazy gray, tinted green by the planet's harsh sun. Rylan powered down the engines, then turned to her. "Stay close. Dehar Prime isn't friendly to your kind." She raised an eyebrow. "And they love yours? Spare me your concerns. I can handle myself." He shrugged, unsealing the hatch. "Suit yourself?" Yet even as he stepped onto the rocky ground, he found himself watching her more closely than he wanted to. Her presence tugged at him like gravity, whether he liked it or not. They climbed down from the craft and walked into the swirling dust of Dehar Prime's atmosphere. All around, shady figures eyed them warily. Most were human or near human, but a few wore cloaks that concealed alien features. This world was a haven for those who fled civilization. As they approached a rundown settlement built into the cliffside, Rylan kept a hand near his weapon. Sariaki strode beside him, unconcerned. "You've been here before," she said, glancing at him. "Once," he admitted. "It didn't end well." He gestured toward a hidden path to the right. "There's a black market armory there. We can restock. Then we vanish." They navigated the winding alleys, passing neon-lit doorways and malfunctioning droids that clanked by on spindly legs. The smell of decay and cheap liquor hung in the air. Occasionally some rough local glared, but no one approached. Perhaps it was the lethal vibe both of them exuded. Inside a dimly lit bunker, they found a merchant who eyed Sariaki's alien skin with blatant curiosity. Rylan made quick negotiations, exchanging stolen code cylinders for fuel and supplies. The merchant nodded, pointing them toward the back room for additional gear. Rylan left a portion of his meager funds on the table. In this place, all that mattered was survival. Sariaki gave him a thoughtful look as they walked out with canisters of refined plasma and a few spare parts for the ship. "You act like a man with a death wish," she said as they returned to the dusty street. "Risking everything for vengeance?" He set the canisters down, turning on her. "My unit was massacred. Friends, family. I lived for them. Since that day, I've lived for revenge." He paused, unsettled by the flicker of sympathy in her strange eyes. "I don't expect you to understand." Her markings shifted faintly. "I understand more than you think. My empire is not kind, even to its own." There was a moment of near vulnerability, but it vanished quickly behind her taunting mask. "Don't mistake me for an ally, human." He gave a curt nod. "Trust me, I won't." They hauled the supplies back to the ship, dust swirling around their ankles. Tension crackled between them, unrelenting. By the time they sealed the hatch, the planet's sun had begun to set, casting an eerie turquoise glow. Rylan stored the canisters in the cargo hold, then wiped sweat from his brow. He felt her presence behind him before she spoke. "That's a lot of fuel," she noted quietly. He straightened, turning to face her. "Enough to get us wherever we need to go." She took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "And where is that? Are you going to keep chasing my people across the galaxy?" He inhaled, fighting the pulse that pounded in his throat. "I'll chase them until I get what I came for. Or until I'm dead." She tilted her chin, studying him with that sharp intelligence. "So you don't care if you lose your life in the process?" He laughed softly. "I already did, the day they killed my friends." Her luminous eyes flicked over him. "Then perhaps you and I are more alike than you'd believe." He didn't know how to respond. A strange hush fell, interrupted only by the beep of a console in the cockpit. They both looked toward it, the tension shifting. He stalked over to the control panel, scanning the incoming signal. A wave of static hissed, and then a familiar insignia flickered on screen, her Empire's crest. She stiffened at his side. "They've tracked us," she murmured, though her voice didn't hold surprise. "I knew it wouldn't take long." Ryland's fists clenched. "We refuel and get out of here. If they corner us, we fight." She gave a curt nod, turning away. But before she could vanish into the ship's corridor, he caught her arm. She froze, and he didn't miss the way her skin heated under his touch. The faint glow of her markings responded to his warmth, shifting in patterns across her arm. "I'm not going to let them take you," he said quietly. "Not until we figure out what's really going on." Her lips twisted. "I'm not sure if you realize how dangerous that is for both of us." He just shook his head. "Danger doesn't scare me." She regarded him for a long beat, then gently pulled her arm free. Her gaze lingered on him, though charged with more than mere distrust. Then she moved away. The moment left him unsteady, brimming with conflicting thoughts. He hated her Empire, wanted them to suffer for what they'd done. But Sariaki herself was an anomaly he couldn't ignore. They spent the next few hours installing the new parts, topping off fuel, and restocking emergency rations. The entire time, the planet's sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the dusty air with sickly green tones. Locals kept their distance, but he felt eyes watching them, as though someone might report their whereabouts. Sariaki kept scanning the horizon, tension evident in the set of her shoulders. Finally, as night fell fully, they retreated inside the ship. Ryland locked the hatch, then slumped into the co-pilot's seat, exhaustion hitting him like a heavy wave. She remained standing, leaning against a bulkhead. In the gloom of the cockpit's instrument lights, her features took on a haunting beauty, the luminescent lines along her neck flickering as she breathed. "You should rest," she said. It wasn't quite concern in her tone, but something softer than before. He shook his head. "I'll rest when we're gone." She frowned. "We can't jump again until the morning. The slipstream lanes around Dehar Prime are too unstable at night. The floating debris makes it suicidal." He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Traveling the slipstream at night from a planet like this, with so many orbiting hazards, was an open invitation to a fiery crash. "Fine," he muttered. "But I'm not letting my guard down." She chuckled, the sound sending a subtle vibration through the metal walls. "Nor will I, human." He stood up from the seat, turning to move toward the sleeping compartment. The craft was small, so the living quarters weren't exactly spacious, just a cramped corridor leading to 2 compartments, each with a narrow bunk. Halfway there, he paused, because she was right behind him. He sensed the heat off her body, the faint hum of her presence. In that moment, the tension that had simmered all day threatened to boil over. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of everything unsaid was suffocating. She stared at him, and the luminous swirl of her markings slowed, as though reading his pulse. He backed up a step, pressing against the cold metal wall. She didn't corner him, she simply stepped closer, refusing to let him escape that electric moment. He found himself remembering the way her body felt in that corridor of the station, locked in combat. How she twisted in his grip, strong and unyielding. The memory flickered through him, igniting a surge of heated adrenaline. He realized he was breathing faster, and so was she. "We're enemies," he said roughly, as though reminding himself. She inclined her head. "Yes," she agreed, but her voice was too soft, too enthralling. "So why haven't you tried to kill me yet?" "I can't kill every single one of your kind," he said. "You..." His words trailed off, not wanting to admit how she fascinated him. "I owe you a debt for helping me escape." She lifted a hand, resting it lightly on the wall beside his head, boxing him in. "Gratitude. Interesting." His jaw clenched. "Don't push it." But he couldn't look away. He felt her breath, warm and slightly sweet, ghosting across his face. He couldn't recall feeling this caught off guard before. Usually, he was the one who intimidated others, but she wasn't intimidated in the slightest. If anything, she reveled in testing him, seeing how far she could push before he snapped. "Humans are so contradictory," she murmured, leaning in. "Your race hates mine, yet you let your guard down so easily." "I haven't let my guard down," he snapped, though his heart hammered. "Trust me." The words tangled in his throat because she was too close, her presence overwhelming. He gripped her shoulder, intending to shove her back, but his hand stayed put, fingers pressing into the muscle beneath her alien skin. She smirked, reading the conflict in his eyes. "Don't pretend you're immune to this." She angled her head. "I can sense it. Your heartbeat. Your heat signature. You're burning, Ryland Voss." She purred his name like a secret, sending a jolt through him. He closed his eyes for half a second, and it was a mistake because the moment he did, his other senses kicked in, the faint hum of her voice, the subsonic thrum that teased along his nerves, the elusive scent of her hair. When he opened his eyes, he saw the triumph in hers, and a reckless impulse soared through his veins. He pivoted, reversing their positions so fast she let out a sharp gasp. Now she was the one pressed against the wall, arms pinned above her head. His chest rose and fell against hers. He felt her warm breath on his neck, and the glow of her markings brightened with every second of contact. She didn't resist. Instead, she stared at him, silent laughter dancing in her gaze. He couldn't tell if she was mocking him or inviting him to go further. "You don't get to tour with me," he said, though his voice was low, barely containing his own rising need. "I'm not one of your fragile victims." She just smirked. "Prove it." For a split second, he considered kissing her just to prove that she didn't hold all the power here. But a flicker of caution cut through the haze. This was still an alien, a dangerous warrior, a potential threat. He wasn't about to lose himself to something he barely understood. He let out a harsh breath and released her arms, stepping back as though her very presence scalded him. She lowered her arms slowly, rubbing her wrists. A ghost of a smile lingered on her lips. "So you do have control after all." He turned away so she wouldn't see the tumult in his expression. "Go to your bunk. We need to leave at dawn." She moved away, footsteps rustling across the cramped corridor. He kept his gaze on the wall, refusing to watch her go. Only when he was sure she was gone did he step into his own bunk, the tension in his body coiled so tight he thought he might snap. In the stillness, he listened for any sign of her. The ship's systems purred. He heard a faint door hiss shut. Then silence. Slowly, he sank onto the bunk, exhausted and half consumed with the adrenaline of their encounter. The day had been a storm of combat, escape, and near betrayal, but the most dangerous part of it all was how drawn he was to the very enemy he'd sworn to hate. He eventually drifted off into a restless doze, though the line between dreaming and waking blurred. At one point, he thought he heard the soft pad of footsteps outside his door, but the moment passed, and in the morning, the only thing that woke him was the ship's automated alarm. Dawn had come to Dehar Prime, though the planet's shifting sky looked no less forbidding than before. He rose, pulled on his gear, and strode to the cockpit. There, he found Sariaki already prepping for takeoff, her spine rigid as she scanned the readouts. She didn't look at him when he entered, but he sensed the tension that coiled between them was no less potent than the night before. He took the co-pilot seat, busying himself with final checks. "Any sign of your people?" "No," she replied curtly. "But that doesn't mean they're not lurking. If we make a run for it now, we might slip by." He nodded, pulling levers. The craft hummed, lifting off the pad in a swirl of dust. Below them, the settlement quickly shrank as they soared into the murky sky. A few local patrol ships hovered, but none engaged. Within minutes, they were breaking atmosphere, drifting once more among the orbiting wreckage. Sariaki angled the ship for the slipstream lane, teeth clenched in concentration. The entire vessel shuddered as they navigated the swirling debris. Ryland kept one eye on the sensors, barking out the occasional warning for incoming fragments. She deftly maneuvered around them, the engine straining with each abrupt change in direction. Their course was harrowing but just feasible, and soon the swirling distortion of the slipstream gate came into view, a hazardous corridor that offered quick travel but at high risk. She wasted no time, slamming the throttle forward. The moment the slipstream's energy field enveloped them, it felt as though they'd been shoved into a cosmic whirlpool. The ship rattled violently, the stars outside streaking into brilliant lines. For a few seconds, Ryland's stomach lurched in protest. Then the turbulence eased, replaced by an eerie calm, the interior lights flickering in the slipstream's glow. Sariaki exhaled, shoulders relaxing. If we survive this jump, we'll come out near the outer colonies. He rubbed his forehead. And then? She shrugged, the motion far too casual. We survive again. Or we die. Her words settled heavily in the cockpit. Ryland stared at the swirling colors outside, remembering the vow he made to avenge his lost comrades. Now, that vow was complicated by the presence of this alien woman who should have been his mortal enemy. The question that gnawed at him was whether the hatred he'd clung to so tightly was slowly being replaced by something far more dangerous. They emerged from the slipstream in a sector dotted with small, scattered colonies on frozen planetoids. Sensors indicated minimal activity. It was a region overshadowed by the might of her empire, yet too remote for them to station massive fleets. A perfect hiding spot, for now. She guided the ship into orbit around a dwarf planet. Thick rings of ice crystals drifted around it, reflecting the faint starlight. Ryland pointed to a large crater on the planet's surface. Set down there. We can find shelter, figure out our next move. She didn't argue. Instead, she took them into a controlled descent through the planet's thin atmosphere. The ground was a windswept expanse of ice and jagged rock, tinted pale blue. The ship trembled as it settled on a relatively flat outcropping. Outside, the temperature gauge read sub-zero. He powered down non-essential systems to conserve fuel. When the engines fell silent, they both unstrapped and stood. The hush in the cockpit was suffocating, broken only by the faint beep of monitors. She glanced at him. We can stay here for a day at most. Then the radiation storms will force us to move. He nodded. At least it gives us time to regroup. She snorted softly, folding her arms. We keep regrouping, yet the fight never ends. Doesn't that tire you, soldier? He shrugged, a bitter edge in his voice. Life is war. At least for me. She studied him, luminous eyes narrowed. And if you found peace, what then? Would you know how to live? His gaze flicked to her, unsettled by the question. Peace isn't an option while your empire hunts me, hunts my people. She didn't deny it. Instead, she brushed past him, heading for the exit ramp. I'm checking the exterior for damage. Try not to get yourself killed while I'm gone. He watched her go, the ramp lowering with a hiss of frigid air. Part of him wanted to follow, to see if she truly intended to inspect the ship, or if she planned to vanish into the ice. But a stronger part urged him to trust that she wouldn't just run. She seemed too invested in their uneasy partnership to bail without warning. Resentment curled in his chest. He hated that he even had to wonder whether she'd stay. Time passed in tense silence. He tinkered with the navigation system, verifying the path away from the radiation storms. Outside, howling winds battered the hull. When the ramp finally rose and sealed, he turned to see her stomping in, brushing flecks of ice from her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed a deeper violet, indicating the cold. She tossed a look at him that was neither friendly nor hostile, more akin to a challenge. It's frigid out there, she said. The hull is holding up, but we've got micro-fractures in the aft plating. Another direct hit from an energy weapon could breach us. He nodded grimly. We'll have to hope we don't face another direct hit. She let out a derisive huff. Hope isn't a plan. He walked up to her, close enough that he could see the patterns on her skin. You have a better idea? Her gaze flicked to his lips for a fraction of a second, then back to his eyes. We survive. That's all. An electric charge hung between them again, the cockpit's lights painting her features in shifting shadows. He saw the exhaustion in her posture, the toll of constant adrenaline. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing a stray lock of her shimmering hair off her brow. She went still, eyes widening slightly. I'm covered in frost, she said, voice tight. Yeah, he murmured, letting his hand drop. You. He didn't finish. The moment was too strange, too thick with everything that had gone unsaid. She stared up at him, her lips parted, the faintest tremor in her breath. He felt a pull that was more intense than anything he'd experienced. Despite the hatred that should be there, despite the reason screaming in his head, he found himself leaning in. She didn't back away. But at the last second, she put a hand against his chest, pressing just firmly enough to keep distance. No, she said, though the reluctance in her tone was unmistakable. Not like this. A rush of frustration and relief battled in him. He took a step back, chest heaving. Then stop staring at me like you want something you can't have. Her markings glowed faintly, betraying a spike in her pulse. You think I want you? He huffed, rubbing his neck. You're the one with heat-sensing skin. You tell me. Her expression flickered with anger, but also something darker, an acknowledgement that he wasn't entirely wrong. She turned away, heading down the corridor. He resisted the urge to follow, to push her further. They were both too keyed up to make rational decisions right now. A breather was what they needed, even if the tension still crackled like a live wire. As she left him alone, he couldn't help feeling that a line had been drawn, one they'd cross eventually, no matter how fiercely they resisted. In the hours that followed, they tried to maintain distance. Sariaki examined the ship's logs, presumably ensuring no one had planted trackers. Rylan organized the cargo bay. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of her. Each time, their eyes locked for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't peaceful. It felt like the building calm before a storm. When night fell on the dwarf planet, the temperature plunged. The hull's sensors beeped warnings about external conditions. Rylan stepped into the bunk area, scanning the readout for interior heat. They had enough power to keep from freezing, but the compartments would be chilly. Another night of forced proximity, he thought sourly. No chance of rest with her so near. He settled onto his bunk, the metal chilled through even with the minimal heat. He considered turning up the thermostat, but that would drain more energy. Instead, he huddled in a spare jacket, letting his mind drift. An hour passed, maybe more, and he almost drifted off. Then the door hissed open. He snapped awake, hand inching toward the blaster at his side. It was her. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, her markings glowing softly. She looked neither menacing nor apologetic, just resolute. It's freezing, she said. The other compartment's heater gave out. I tried repairing it. He stared, his heart thudding. And you want what? Her jaw set, like she hated asking. Let me share the heat in here. I'd sooner keep some distance, but freezing to death isn't my preference. He exhaled, every muscle tight. And you're certain you won't knife me in my sleep? She gave a dry laugh, stepping into the bunk area. You'd wake up before I could do any real damage. And you'd do the same to me, yes? We can keep weapons at arm's reach if that makes you feel better. He shifted, allowing her a spot on the bunk. The bed was narrow, forcing them into close quarters. The moment she sat, the mattress dipped. Her arm brushed his, and he fought not to jerk away as electricity jolted through him. She wore only a lightweight outfit beneath that armor, the violet of her skin mesmerizing in the low light. He felt her body heat, and was startled by how it ignited his senses. You don't have to be so tense, she murmured, leaning back against the wall. He let out a breath that misted in the cold air. Right. This is perfectly normal, enemies sharing a bunk in a frozen tin can on a dead planet. Relaxing. She rolled her eyes, yet a faint smirk touched her lips. Silence stretched. Gradually, the collective warmth of their bodies did improve the temperature. He noticed the subtle shift of her breathing, how she was just as aware of his presence as he was of hers. For a while, either spoke, each trying not to give in to the tension. Eventually, she broke the silence. My people, we were told humans are savage, warlike, lacking sophistication. But some of you have spirit. She spoke quietly, as if admitting a secret. You fight with reckless abandon. I find it unexpectedly compelling. He snorted, crossing his arms. So we're savage but compelling? Don't let it go to your head. Yet he caught the flicker in her eyes, an acknowledgment of his strength, and the respect it commanded. I've fought many battles. Few men have pinned me the way you did. Heat surged in him at the memory. You gave as good as you got. She smiled faintly, turning her gaze to the low ceiling. Yes. I did. They lapsed into another quiet spell. He could smell her now, something faintly sweet and metallic. It seeped into his awareness, making it hard to think straight. His heartbeat sped. He wanted to close the distance, to taste the challenge in her grin. But old instincts reminded him that this was the enemy. She might be tempting him for her own agenda. He didn't trust her. He shouldn't trust her. Yet as the minutes dragged on, the cold pressed them closer. At some point, she shifted, resting against his side. His arm curled around her reflexively, and her head fit beneath his chin. He froze, half expecting her to jerk away or mock him. Instead, she let out a low exhale. He felt the rumble of it, goosebumps rippling across his skin. He told himself it was just practicality, body heat shared so they wouldn't freeze. But the quiet hum of acceptance from her told him there was more at play. Tension swelled, either of them voicing it. Slowly, carefully, his hand settled on her side. Her breath hitched. Outside, the wind howled, scraping ice against the hull, but in here, they were cocooned in a fragile bubble of forced intimacy. Then, abruptly, her muscles tightened. She sat up, eyes blazing. Enough, she said, though her voice shook with suppressed energy. I won't let biology or circumstances bend me. She swung her legs off the bunk. He rose as well, grabbing her wrist gently. You think I'm trying to seduce you? Her gaze flicked down to where his hand held her. Isn't that what you want? He clenched his jaw. I don't know what I want. Honesty hurt as it left his mouth. I know I can't stand the thought of you leaving. But I also know my unit's blood is on your people's hands. She made a low sound, yanking free of his grip. My entire life has been about serving an empire that never asked my permission. You think I chose it? Maybe we're both just tools in someone else's war. He grabbed the collar of her shirt, frustration boiling over. If you're just a tool, then stop playing these games, he growled. Stop looking at me like. She slapped his hand away and shoved him hard. He stumbled against the wall, anger flaring. In an instant, she was in front of him, pressing him back with surprising force. The small space magnified every motion, every breath. He couldn't resist the urge to grab her shoulders and flip their positions, pinning her so the bunk was behind her. She hissed, eyes aflame with defiance. Neither wanted to back down. The air crackled with that primal electricity again. A humiliating part of him wanted to surrender to her closeness, but he also wanted to conquer her. It was a twisted dance of desire and rage, both fueled by the same molten heat. She lifted her chin, lips inches from his. Her breath caught. Human, she whispered, though it sounded like a curse and a plea all at once. Then she shoved at his chest again, but this time he didn't budge. He was done letting her hold the upper hand. With a guttural sound, he scooped her up, spinning around, and dropped her onto the narrow bunk. She landed on her back with a grunt, luminous eyes wide. Before she could retaliate, he covered her, bracing his arms on either side of her head. The bunk creaked beneath their combined weight. Her chest rose and fell, a swirl of color dancing across her throat. She glared up at him, and he glared right back. So this is how you want to end it? She challenged, voice throbbing with tension. He lowered his face closer to hers. I don't know, he ground out. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this. His body thrummed like a live wire, heart pounding. He expected her to fight, to call him weak, to throw him off. Instead, her fingers curled in his shirt, pulling him even closer. He saw the flash of indecision in her eyes, the war between hatred and undeniable attraction. He wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe both. Their lips collided in a fierce clash, a violent meeting that tasted of anger and desperate need. It was more battle than kiss, teeth clashing, breaths tangling. She bit his lower lip hard enough that he tasted blood, and he answered by crushing his mouth to hers, pouring weeks, months, years of pent-up fury into that moment. She moaned against him, nails scraping his scalp. For a heartbeat, he thought she'd tear him apart, but instead she grabbed his neck, pulling him deeper. Their bodies were molded together, limbs tangling on the cramped bunk. The cold air was forgotten. Her skin's bioluminescent patterns pulsed brighter than he'd ever seen, sending flickering purple-blue light across the narrow walls. He gripped her thigh, hooking it around his waist, and felt her tremble. She might have been alien, but her heat was all too real. She tore her mouth away, eyes wild. "Damn you!" she whispered, though it sounded more like surrender than threat. He buried a hand in her hair, pressing his forehead to hers. "Damn me!" he repeated, voice ragged. "I don't care." They didn't speak further. With a half-feral intensity, they succumbed to the moment, the bunk creaking as they struggled for dominance. It was a clash of two warriors who refused to yield, each wanting to conquer and be conquered, each move a test of power. But beneath the fierceness, there was relief in finally letting the tension snap. She kissed him with bruising force, and he answered in kind, his hands sliding up the small of her back. Their breathing was harsh, echoing in the small compartment. At some point, he wasn't sure if the dryness in his throat came from desire or fear of what came after. But he couldn't stop. She gripped him like he might vanish if she let go, and each time he tried to move slower, she urged him on with a yank of his shirt or a dig of her nails into his skin. For a moment, the war that raged outside didn't exist. It was just them, locked in a tempest of want and conflict. He half expected her to surge up and slam him onto his back, and maybe she considered it. Her muscles bunched beneath him, quivering with tension, but she didn't break away. Instead, she let him devour her mouth, allowed him to feel the racing thrum of her pulse. Every nerve was on fire. When at last they broke apart, panting, they stared at each other in the dim glow of her markings. He saw confusion in her gaze, mirrored by his own. They had crossed a boundary that changed everything. She didn't speak, and he wasn't sure what words could convey the chaos burning in his chest. After a few seconds, he shifted, rolling off her to let them both breathe. She stayed on her side, eyes fixed on the bulkhead, chest heaving. He studied the profile of her face, lit by the flickering patterns on her skin. Part of him wanted to speak, to apologize or demand answers, but something told him neither of them was ready for that. Instead, he lay there, letting the aftershocks ripple through his body. Eventually, her breathing slowed, and she rolled to face him, lips parted in silence. He reached out, gently brushing her hair back from her temple. This time, she didn't flinch away or mock him. They fell into an uneasy sleep, limbs entangled, still armed with the knowledge that they were enemies. And yet, for that night, they were more than that. They were survivors sharing warmth, battling the same ghosts, each caught in the gravitational pull of the other's unspoken needs. When morning came, the planet's harsh light seeped through the ship's ports, illuminating the bunk. She stirred first, blinking. He watched her wake, watched awareness settle like a weight. She pulled away from him, pressing a hand to her forehead. He half expected a snarl or angry remark, but instead she sat up in silence. He followed suit, and they avoided each other's eyes for a moment. He dressed quickly, buckling on weapons and gear. She stood, crossing the small space to check an instrument panel that displayed the planet's atmospheric conditions. Outside, swirling winds had kicked up, tinted by the stars' shifting radiation. He joined her, scanning the readouts. "We'll have to leave soon," he said quietly. "This storm won't let up." She nodded once. Agreed. They both moved into the cockpit without addressing the night's events. But the tension was different now, still charged, but tangled with the memory of what they'd allowed. As the engines roared to life, they braced for takeoff, eyes straight ahead. The ice planet's surface shrank beneath them, the battered craft shuddering. They shot into orbit, scanning for any sign of hostile ships. The sensors remained empty, at least for now. Slowly, they navigated away from the dwarf planet, heading into deeper space. A hush filled the cockpit. Finally, she cleared her throat. Any particular destination, or do we drift until your revenge finds us? He slid her a glance. I have an idea. My old commanding officer left behind coordinates to a remote outpost. It might offer answers about your empire's next moves. She frowned, arms crossed. You think you'll find some hidden plan there? He shrugged, turning back to the star charts. I don't know. But it's a lead. She was silent for a moment, as though weighing her options. All right, she said eventually. We'll follow your lead. But don't get comfortable. I'm not your ally. He pressed his lips together, trying to keep the flicker of emotion off his face. I remember. They set course, the starfield blurring around them. Hours trickled by with minimal conversation, each of them immersed in their own thoughts. But the memory of the previous night clung like a magnetic field. Whenever their eyes met, sparks flew. He tried to bury his mind in the navigation data, but he could almost feel her gaze slip over him when she thought he wasn't looking. At one point, he ventured into the corridor to stretch his legs. She was there, leaning against a bulkhead, arms folded. The hum of the ship's engines provided an ambient bass note. Without a word, they locked eyes. He started to brush past her, but she seized his wrist. The sudden contact jolted him, and he glared, though there was no real anger in his eyes. Say what you want to say, he muttered. She stepped closer, her voice low. You think last night changes things between us? He hesitated, every muscle drawn taut. If it did, would that be so terrible? She stared at him, her markings flickering with agitation. It was a moment of weakness. A foolish indulgence. Her words stung more than he cared to admit. Fine, he growled, pulling free. Next time, I'll remember that. He pushed past her and made his way to the cargo hold, trying to calm the surge of conflicting emotions. She let him go without protest, but he felt the weight of her gaze for a long time after. They were stuck in an impossible loop. Every instinct told them to fight, yet their bodies betrayed them with undeniable attraction. Later, as they approached the coordinates on the outpost, the sensors pinged. Ryland scowled at the readouts. There's a massive debris field in orbit, left over from a battle. We'll need to navigate carefully. She slipped into the pilot's seat beside him. I'll handle it. He almost argued but decided to let her do what she did best. She guided the ship around jagged hull fragments and the drifting carcasses of destroyed vessels. The outpost came into view, a lonely structure clinging to a small moon, lights flickering from battered solar arrays. Scans indicated minimal life support, no significant population. Perfect for secrets to be hidden. They landed near an airlock. The entire place seemed deserted, only the hum of emergency power systems breaking the silence. Ryland slung a rifle over his shoulder. Stay close, he told her. We don't know what's in there. She followed without complaint, and they stepped through the airlock into stale corridors lit by flickering overheads. The walls bore scorch marks from old fights. Doors hung ajar. They passed storage rooms filled with half-burned crates, bits of equipment strewn about as though everyone left in a hurry. This place was abandoned, she said, her voice echoing. Why would your commanding officer leave coordinates here? He shrugged. Let's find out. He mentioned a secure data core in his files. Maybe it's still intact. They pressed deeper into the outpost, the air chilling as life support struggled to maintain stable conditions. Occasional rattles of metal made them tense, but they found no immediate threat. Finally, they reached a sealed door with a console. Ryland entered the override codes from his late commander's notes. The door hissed open, revealing a small command center. In the center stood a battered data tower. He approached, heart pounding. Maybe this was the lead he needed. If it held information about the Empire's weaknesses or supply lines, he could use it. Sariaki watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He started the data download, grimacing at how slow the battered system was. Keep an eye out, he said quietly. She gave a curt nod. Time dragged as the progress bar crawled. Then the hair on the back of his neck stood up, a primal sense of being watched. He glanced at her, she sensed it too. Together they tensed, scanning the dim corners of the command center. The lights flickered, revealing flickers of movement in the corridor beyond. A figure stepped into view, a tall, armored alien wearing the Empire's insignia. Not just any soldier, but an elite, judging by the shimmering black plating. Sariaki stiffened, her eyes widening. The soldier paused, then raised a weapon. A voice resonated in the gloom. "So this is where you've been hiding, traitor." Rylan recognized the language as hers, though the soldier had used a translator. His gaze cut to Sariaki. "Friend of yours?" She snarled under her breath, stepping forward. "No friend. He's one of the Empire's executioners. They dispatched them to deal with problems." The soldier aimed his pulse rifle. "You've allied with a human," he hissed. "Pathetic. You'll both die here." Rylan dived for cover, returning fire. Sariaki released a subsonic wail that made the soldier stagger. He recovered quickly, though, flipping a switch on his armor. Some anti-M shield, Rylan guessed. Great. The soldier opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling past them. They scattered, flanking him from both sides. The command center erupted in chaos, sparks flying from consoles as stray shots landed. "Finish the download!" Rylan shouted, ducking behind a column. He saw the data tower still transferring, progress at 70%. They needed that intel. He squeezed off shots, forcing the soldier to take cover. But the soldier was skilled, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Rylan grimaced as a chunk of the wall near his head vaporized. Sariaki darted in, using her speed to close the gap. She aimed a strike at the soldier's weapon arm, but he blocked, delivering a punishing blow that sent her skidding. She hissed in pain, luminous markings flaring. Rylan used the distraction to blast the soldier's shield generator. It sparked, shorting out. The soldier cursed, turning on Rylan. Sariaki seized the opening, lashing out with a palm strike to the soldier's throat. The soldier reeled, coughing, but didn't go down. He raked a clawed gauntlet across Sariaki's side. She bit back a cry, and Rylan unleashed a barrage of bullets into the soldier's back. The armor absorbed some shots, but not all. The soldier fell to a knee, defiant to the end. Sariaki stumbled, pressing a hand to her wound. In a final act of desperation, the soldier triggered a remote device. Alarms blared. Rylan's eyes darted to the data tower, 95%. "We're almost there," Sariaki hissed, clutching her side. "He's going to blow this place." The soldier's laughter echoed. "You're both doomed." A beep sounded from his armor. Self-destruct. Rylan cursed, sprinting to grab the data module. The progress bar hit 100. He yanked the module free just as the soldier's body began to glow with building energy. Sariaki lunged away, and Rylan followed, diving behind a console. A deafening explosion rocked the command center, sending waves of heat and shrapnel. Sparks rained down, consoles bursting into flame. The soldier was gone, vaporized by his own device. Rylan coughed, ears ringing. He scrambled to his feet, scanning for Sariaki. She was slumped against the far wall, panting, her side bleeding. He rushed over, wrapping an arm around her. "Can you walk?" he shouted over the roar of flames. She grimaced, eyes blazing with pain. "I'll manage." They staggered out of the command center, the outpost shaking as secondary blasts detonated. They had the data, but survival was now top priority. Debris fell from the ceiling, corridors filling with black smoke. Rylan half-carried her, heartbeat thunderous. If she couldn't walk, he'd drag her. He wasn't leaving without her. They barely made it to the airlock. The outpost trembled as though on the brink of collapse. Once inside their ship, Rylan slammed the hatch and hit the thrusters, launching them off the crumbling moon. The screens showed the outpost tearing itself apart behind them, showering space with wreckage. In the cockpit, Sariaki let out a choked breath, pressing a hand to her bleeding side. Rylan rummaged for the medkit, cursing. "Show me." She winced. "It's just a scratch." he glared, helping her peel back the edge of her shirt. The wound was deeper than she admitted. Purple blood trickled down her side, and her luminous markings flickered erratically. He cursed again, applying a coagulant. She hissed, but held still, sweat beading on her forehead. "This is going to sting," he warned, pressing a bonding patch over the wound. She clenched her teeth, muscles rigid with pain. He worked quickly, ignoring how the closeness stirred that unwanted desire again. When he finished, she closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. "Thank you," she murmured grudgingly. He nodded, the tension in his jaw easing. "Just don't die. We have too much unfinished business." She let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Don't worry. I'm not done with you yet." The raw honesty in her voice made his chest tighten. He stepped back, disposing of the bloodied swabs. Silence fell, broken by the ship's autopilot prompts. He inserted the data module into the console, scanning the encrypted files. Lines of code scrolled by. He could barely parse the language, but certain coordinates jumped out at him. He felt his stomach twist. Sariaki shifted, pushing herself upright. "What is it?" He scrolled further. "Looks like your empire has some massive project under wraps. These coordinates. There's a facility hidden on a planet called Daryan 5. My guess is it's a weapons facility." She frowned, pressing a hand to her bandaged side. "Why would your commanding officer care about that?" "Because it might be the location of the device they used to ambush my unit. Some advanced tracking array or superweapon. I'm not sure." He exhaled, jaw tight. "If it's there, I have to destroy it." She stared at the readouts, her expression unreadable. "That facility is rumored to be heavily guarded. You'd be walking into certain death." He shot her a fierce look. "Then let them come. I've waited too long for vengeance." She bit her lip, conflicted. "If you go, I'm going with you. This empire is no friend of mine." He blinked. "Why would you help me destroy your own people's facility?" A dark shadow crossed her features. "Because they tried to kill me just now. And they will again. Because they treat us all like expendable pawns. Perhaps it's time someone showed them otherwise." For the first time, he saw real anger, even hatred, in her eyes for her own empire. The thought of them as reluctant allies made something stir inside him, a flicker of hope, or maybe just grim resolve. If they could unite against a common enemy, maybe they stood a chance. He nodded slowly. "Then we do this together." She held his gaze, tension thrumming between them once more, though this time it was tempered by shared purpose. He could still taste the memory of her kiss, the bruising intensity of it, and yet now they were discussing war and infiltration. It was madness. But that was all they knew. Wordlessly, he moved to the cockpit console and charted a course for Daryan 5. She joined him, wincing as she settled into the pilot's seat. Through the viewport, the starfield stretched infinite, dotted with the wreckage of worlds left in the Empire's wake. They had a new heading, a new purpose. It was reckless, possibly suicidal. And yet, as they prepared the jump, he felt a surge of grim excitement. They would face the Empire on its own ground. They would tear down whatever monstrous weapon they hid. And if they survived, maybe they'd be free of their ghosts, free to see if the fire that burned between them could be anything but destructive. The hum of the engines rose, the slipstream swirling. He threw Sariaki a sidelong glance, caught her slight nod. Then they leapt into the vortex of light, hurtling toward a decisive end neither could predict. When they emerged near Daryan 5, a stark planet with swirling storm clouds, he felt his chest tighten. The scanners showed multiple orbital platforms, heavy patrols, and a surface dotted with fortress-like structures. This was no simple outpost, it was a stronghold. Sariaki breathed out, and her skin markings brightened with apprehension. "You still want to do this?" she asked quietly. He set his jaw. "I won't turn back now." She nodded, and together they planned a risky infiltration. They found a blind spot in the orbiting patrols, slipping through the atmosphere under heavy turbulence. By the time they landed in a ravine just outside the facility's perimeter, the ship's hull was battered, engine whining. They shut down all but essential power, cloaking themselves from sensors. Dressed in battle gear, weapons loaded, they stepped onto the rocky plain. Acidic mist rolled across the ground, stinging Ryland's exposed skin. Sariaki's violet complexion changed hue in the corrosive air, but she pressed on, ignoring discomfort. In the distance, the facility's lights glowed, ringed by towering walls and guard towers. A rumble of thunder echoed overhead, and lightning forked across greenish clouds. They crept through jagged rock formations, hearts hammering in tandem. Any slip, and they'd be detected. Ryland led them to a side gate, lightly guarded compared to the main entrance. He eyed the cameras. "I can take out the guards. You handle the alarms?" She nodded, lips tight. They synchronized their attack. He dropped the first 2 guards with silenced shots. She unleashed a pulse that shorted the cameras for a brief window. They sprinted, slipping inside. The facility's interior was a maze of corridors, labs, and cargo bays. Lights flickered in sterile white overhead. The hum of advanced machinery resonated beneath their feet. At each turn, they encountered more resistance, patrolling squads, automated turrets. Their progress was a dance of lethal precision. Ryland's bullets and fists broke anyone who stood in their path, while Sariaki used her electromagnetic powers to disable turrets and scramble armor shields. The deeper they went, the more the tension spiked. If they were cornered, there would be no escape route. Finally, they reached a massive chamber housing a cylindrical device thrumming with energy. The readings on Ryland's scanner spiked. This was it, the Empire's rumored superweapon. The device pulsed with an eerie purple glow, arcs of energy crackling along its surface. Techs in lab coats scattered as they burst in, alarm klaxons sounding. Ryland tossed an explosive charge at the base of the device. Sariaki covered him, unleashing subsonic blasts that stunned guards. But the moment he armed the explosives, a squad of elite soldiers stormed in, weapons blazing. Gunfire and energy bolts ricocheted. Ryland rolled behind cover, returning fire. A bullet clipped his shoulder. He swore, blood soaking his sleeve. Sariaki cried out his name. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep shooting. They were outnumbered, pinned down. The bomb's timer was ticking. If they couldn't clear out, they'd die in the explosion. She ducked beside him, eyes wide. "We have to pull back." He shook his head, chest heaving. "We can't let them disarm it." He gestured to the soldiers converging on the device. They were already trying to disable the charge. Sariaki swore in her language, then took a deep breath. She stood up, stepping out from cover. Her markings flared bright as a sun, the air crackling around her. Ryland realized what she intended too late. She released a devastating electromagnetic surge. The wave of energy blasted across the chamber, frying circuits, shorting weapons, and sending men sprawling. Even the superweapon flickered, arcs of energy dancing erratically. But the strain was immense. She dropped to her knees, gasping, the glow of her skin sputtering as if she'd overloaded her own body. Ryland grabbed her, slinging her arm around his neck. "Come on!" He half dragged her away from the console where the bomb was armed. Smoke billowed, sparks rained down. The facility's structure groaned ominously. The soldiers who weren't incapacitated by her blast scattered, the alarms deafening. Ryland and Sariaki limped through corridors they'd just come from, searching desperately for an exit. The entire complex shook as the device's energy rose to catastrophic levels. They stumbled out a side door into a raging storm, acid rain slicing across their faces. The building behind them roared as the bomb detonated, sending a shockwave that tore the ground. They were flung forward, crashing into the mud. Debris rained from the sky. For a moment, everything was a whirlwind of dust, fire, and agony. Ryland's ears rang. He tasted blood. When the storm of destruction subsided, he pushed himself upright, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. Sariaki lay a few feet away, unmoving. Fear stabbed him. He crawled to her, rolling her over gently. She groaned, eyes fluttering open. Relief flooded him. He pulled her up, supporting her weight as they staggered away from the inferno behind them. The facility was in ruins, flames shooting skyward. Whatever superweapon the Empire had, it was now obliterated. Rylan let out a breath that felt like a victory cry. He glanced at her, and she gave a weak smirk. "Reckless human!" she rasped, voice laced with exhausted relief. He barked a laugh, which turned into a cough. "Reckless alien!" he countered. They stumbled through the rocky terrain, heading back to where they'd hidden their ship. The storm battered them every step. Twice, they nearly fell off ledges or slid into pits of acid-scorched rock. But they kept each other upright. Finally, they saw the craft's outline in the distance. They limped aboard, sealed the hatch, and collapsed on the metal floor, breathing heavily. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, a quiet enveloped them. Rylan slowly sat up, pressing a hand to his wound. She propped herself against the wall, wiping rain and blood from her face. Despite the pain, they looked at each other, sharing the raw intensity of survival. He moved closer, checking her bandaged side. The dressing was soaked, the wound reopening. She grimaced, letting him peel it back gently. Her blood glistened, but not as bad as he feared. "We need to clean and stitch it," he muttered, rummaging for the medkit. She nodded tiredly, letting him do what needed to be done. He disinfected the area, feeling the fine tremors that ran through her body. Each time she winced, he murmured a quiet apology. When the wound was closed and bandaged anew, she leaned her head back, eyes drifting shut. "I'm not dying today," she declared, voice wavering but determined. "No, you're not," he agreed, pressing a patch to his own shoulder, hissing at the sting. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving them both spent. A hush fell, broken only by the moan of wind outside. They were alive, battered but victorious. The Empire's deadly project lay in ruins. Rylan found himself gazing at her. She was soaked, bruised, but still radiant, still fierce. A wave of respect and something deeper flooded him. Carefully, he reached out, brushing his knuckles across her cheek. She opened her eyes, meeting his stare with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Without warning, she pulled him closer, pressing her forehead to his. The gesture wasn't quite a kiss, but it was something far more intimate. He exhaled shakily, cupping the back of her head. They stayed like that, breathing each other's air, the storm raging around them, hearts pounding in sync. Whatever they called themselves now, enemies, lovers, reluctant allies, they had forged a bond in the fires of battle that couldn't be broken so easily. He gently tilted her chin, meeting her gaze. "We destroyed it," he murmured. "They won't use it to hurt anyone else. My unit, they're avenged." She nodded, emotion flickering across her face. "And I've severed my last tie to them. There's no going back for me." He pressed his lips to her forehead, closing his eyes. "Then we move forward," he said softly. "Together." A trembling sigh escaped her. She slid her arms around him, resting her head on his shoulder. The tension that had once defined their every moment finally gave way to a fragile kind of peace. Outside, lightning flashed, thunder rolled, but inside this small craft, they held each other like survivors on a lifeboat, drifting away from the wreckage of their old lives. No words were needed to confirm what they both already felt, that this moment was hard won, and that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. There was no more room for illusions. Their fates were entwined, bound by blood and fire, hatred and longing. In that quiet, battered vessel on a storm-ravaged planet, they found the closest thing to solace either had known. And for once, it was enough.